Okay, now in this third clip of the senses, we're going to talk about hearing and equilibrium. So we recall the cranial nerves, and the eighth cranial nerve is a two-part nerve. One of them is related to balance, okay, and one is related to hearing. And these two branches will join together and then go back to the cortex for interpretation. If we recall, the cerebellum has a role in balance. It has tracts that connect to a number of places, and one of them is information about the position of our body and muscles and tendons called proprioceptors. So the best way to imagine what this would feel like is if you didn't have that connection is imagine you're coming in quietly. Maybe you're beyond your think back if you're young to your curfew time and you're a little bit late and you don't want to wake everybody up, so you're sneaking up the stairs. You get to the top of the stairs and you think there's one more step. So you take that step, but there's no step. So you lose your balance a little bit because in your brain you had your muscles connected to thinking there was one more step. Likewise, when you come down the steps and you miss a step, you put everything out of sync because your muscles and tendons were ready for that next step. So this is all related to impulses going to the cerebellum from the eighth cranial nerve, and that helps you. That's the equilibrium and the balance part. So first we're going to look at the ear. So the ear is divided into the outer ear, or external, sometimes it's called external, the middle ear, okay, and the internal ear. Three parts to it. The external or the outer ear, of course, is what we know as our earlobe or the auricle or the pinna, and you notice that it's a funnel shaped and directs inwardly to the auditory canal. And that's how we collect the sound waves and direct it inward. The middle ear includes the eardrum or the tympanic cavity. So this is sort of like a round thing. And in health assessment, when you get a look at it in your ear, when you look at it with your eye in the ear, you'll see that it looks a little bit depressed and pulled inwardly because it's got a connection on this side that goes to the inside there. As well, what we have is a cavity in the middle, tympanic cavity, okay? And also we have these three little bones called the malleus, incus, and stapes. And they are the very smallest bones, and they'll fit on the end of your index finger, all three of them. You may know them as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup, but we will never refer to them as that. So think M-I-S, malleus, incus, and stapes. The tympanic membrane separates the external and middle ear, and it's semi-transparent. It's mucous membrane on the inside, and it's cone-shaped because it's attached, as I said earlier, onto the auditory ossicles. Sound waves are going to enter and the auditory meatus, okay, and that's here, okay. Sound waves are going to come in here. That's going to create pressure. Pressure is going to vibrate this, which will vibrate the internal the auditory ossicles, which then in turn will be transferred here to the oval window, which will cause the fluids in this area to move, and that triggers the receptors for our hearing. Take note of where the auditory tube is, okay? The auditory tube is here. This is going to go connect to your throat, and it's also called, you may know it as the eustachian tube. Same thing. The inner ear has a series of tubes and chambers called the labyrinth. That's this structure here. We will look at it in detail. I think there's another picture coming up. I'm just going to go in there. Right. We've talked about all this. So this is the inner structure here. Okay. Now imagine that structure being like a tube with a tire. Okay. There's two parts to it, and I'm just going to go a few slides over. Okay, so you see this purple part in there? That's like the inner tube, and this is like the tire itself, the outside brown. And one is bony, okay, and one is like tissue. The inner part is tissue, and the outer part is a bony structure. Within that, we have two different fluids. So if you can see this, it's kind of dark, but this is the bony part here, this first one, and then this is the membranous, the purple. In between, there's fluid here and fluid here. The fluid between the bony lymph and the membranous is called perilymph. Peri means around, and the dark purple fluid that would be inside this piece is the endolymph. Endo referring to inside. Okay. And there's some notes. I'm just going to go back to the notes here. Okay, so remember where the location of these are. So we have the outside part of that structure is like the tire, and the inside is like the inner tube, and it has two sets of fluid. You'll also notice that it's semicircular canals. So we have this part here, which are the semicircular canals, which lay at right angles, and the fluid inside, when it moves, assists us with equilibrium. The cochlear portion right here, okay, is the part about hearing. So if we took that piece like this, it's wound like this, and we laid it straight out, it would be like one tube. But in that tube, then there are a number of structures, and the structure that helps us with our hearing is called the organ of Corti. So this is the tube laid out, and through the middle of it, you see this structure. And when the fluids vibrate in there, they pull on this and send it to the cochlear portion of the 8th cranial nerve, and it causes a sensation to go back, and we record what we hear. So again, this part is about equilibrium, and this part is about hearing. We have two nerves coming to join and become the 8th cranial nerve there. So this last piece is a summary. So we hear things, and it collects by our eardrum, sends it inwardly, which causes the eardrum or the tympanic membrane to vibrate, which in turn causes those little malleus, incus, and stapes, called the auditory ossicles, to vibrate, which is attached to the labyrinth in the inside, causes that to wiggle, and when that wiggles, it moves the fluid. The fluid passes over that structure called the organ of Corti, which in turn then excites the vestibular cochlear nerve. Now that's very, very simply put. Okay. Of course, there's textbooks about hearing, and there's whole courses about hearing, but we just want you to have the basic understanding of that.